Her granddaughter gave away her art collection without asking. Marlene Whitcomb, lifelong curator and retired professor, didn't yell. She picked up the phone and called her lawyer. By the end of the week, museum staff were unhooking every frame from the wall, on court orders. Haley thought she'd inherited a legacy. What she got instead was a masterclass in consequences, taught by the woman who built it. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The glossy invitation arrived without warning, its pristine surface reflecting the soft afternoon sunlight as it sat innocently on Marlene Whitcomb's kitchen table. She didn't recognize the return address. Her hands trembled slightly as she tore it open, the weight of the moment heavier than it should have been for something so elegant. Her eyes skimmed the header. The Whitcomb Collection, a gift to the city. She froze, brow furrowing in confusion. A gift? Her collection, her life's work, painstakingly curated over decades, was not a gift. It wasn't a gesture of charity or benevolence. It was her legacy. The text beneath was a blur as her heart raced, skipping beats with the mounting panic. The words didn't make sense. She flipped the invitation over, hoping to find a mistake, something that would clarify the situation, but instead, her gaze locked onto the bottom line. Generously donated by Haley Whitcomb. Haley, her granddaughter, the one who always wanted more, who thought everything could be bought or given away. Marlene felt her blood run cold, the nausea creeping up her throat. She didn't ask. She never asked. The collection wasn't hers to give, to steal, to sell. Marlene stood up suddenly, the chair scraping across the floor in protest. She turned toward her study. There was no sound, only the oppressive silence that had lingered too long in the house after the last dinner party years ago. The study door creaked open, the familiar scent of wood and dust hitting her like a punch to the gut. And then, her heart stopped. Half the paintings were gone. Empty spaces stared back at her, like missing teeth in the mouth of a once beautiful face. She crossed the room, her hands reaching out, fingers trembling as they brushed against the blank walls. The frames, the carefully chosen placements, all disrupted. Gone. All gone. The phone in her hand felt suddenly heavier, as though it was mocking her. With swift, deliberate movements, she dialed Haley's number, pressing the phone to her ear, listening to the ringing that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Her breath was shallow, heart pounding, each second that passed without an answer stretching into eternity. Voicemail. Haley, it's Grandma. Call me. Her voice was steadier than she felt. She hung up, the silence swallowing her whole. There were no more questions now. This wasn't a mistake, a misunderstanding. It was a declaration. And it hurt. It hurt in ways she hadn't thought possible. This feeling of betrayal sharp and unforgiving. A few hours later, the doorbell rang. The sudden sound nearly made her jump out of her skin. Marlene opened the door to find Connor standing on the porch, his frame blocking out the last light of the setting sun. His face was unreadable, but the faint tightness around his mouth told her everything. I didn't know she went through with it, he said, stepping inside, his eyes scanning the study, taking in the empty spaces, the collection that had been stolen from them both. Marlene closed the door behind him, her hands gripping the edge of the doorknob as though it was the only thing keeping her upright. She did, Marlene replied, her voice cold and distant, even to her own ears. She gave it away, without asking, without even considering. She trailed off, the words sticking in her throat, stuck like bile. Connor crossed the room to stand beside her, his gaze falling on the empty frames. He didn't say anything at first, just took in the scene with the same stoic silence that had always defined him. It was as though the enormity of what had been taken could not be processed in just a few words. She has no right, Marlene finally managed, her voice trembling despite herself. Connor nodded slowly. No, she doesn't. The weight of the words hung heavy between them. Marlene could feel the edges of her calm slipping away, the anger and hurt beginning to swell in her chest. Her hand curled into a fist at her side, her nails biting into her palm. She needed to do something. She needed to make it right. "She'll hear from my lawyer," Marlene muttered, turning to walk toward the phone on her desk. "Julian will fix this." But as she reached the desk, something inside her recoiled. Julian could fight this, could send a letter, could file a lawsuit. But that wasn't enough. This wasn't about paperwork or courtroom victories. This was personal. This was her life, her work. And no one, not even Haley, had the right to take it from her. Marlene's fingers hovered over the phone, hesitation paralyzing her for just a moment before she finally picked up the receiver. She needed to take action. She couldn't let this stand. Her pulse quickened as she dialed, her mind already racing ahead to the steps she'd need to take to reclaim what was rightfully hers. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the phone rang, the doorbell chimed again, a sudden jolt in the silence. Marlene's hand froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was almost too familiar. It was the same ring she had heard so many times before, in moments of uncertainty. And then she heard it. Click. Someone had entered the house. The click echoed down the hall like a threat. Marlene turned sharply, every muscle in her body tight, only to see Connor stepping back inside, a folder tucked under his arm. "Spare key," he said quickly, reading the alarm on her face. "You gave it to me last year after the storm, remember?" She exhaled, slow and shaky, the tension easing by a fraction. "Right," she murmured, pressing a hand to her chest. "Right." The moment passed, but her pulse didn't settle. Not yet. Connor set the folder on the table. "I brought the insurance binder. Might help." For the next hour, the house was a symphony of rustling paper and low murmurs. Marlene's once organized study was now a battlefield of folders, invoices, and yellowing receipts. Every painting had a paper trail, a lifetime of signatures and provenance records meticulously filed under her name. She laid each one out on the desk like evidence in a trial. "This one," she said, sliding a document across the desk. "Purchased at Sotheby's, 1983. Paid in full. My check, my name." Connor adjusted his glasses and scanned it, then placed it in the verified stack. "And this," she continued, "the Channing landscape, acquired directly from the artist. I have the correspondence." One by one they built the case, their quiet focus edged with anger. The rhythm of scanning and cataloging became a form of vengeance, deliberate, methodical, unstoppable. The hum of the old scanner filled the room, punctuated only by the soft shuffle of papers. At one point, Connor looked up, his expression unreadable. She must have known these existed. She had to. "Oh, she knew," Marlene replied, her tone cool and sharp. "She just assumed I wouldn't fight back." By the time they finished, it was nearly dark. The last document slid from the scanner, its faint mechanical whir fading into silence. Marlene sat back, exhausted but steady. "That's 22 paintings accounted for," she said quietly. "Every one of them mine." She reached for the phone again, this time without hesitation. Her lawyer's number was etched into memory. It rang twice before a calm, measured voice answered. "Julian Cross." "It's Marlene Whitcomb." A pause, then, "I take it this isn't a social call." "Haley donated my collection," she said, her tone clipped, every syllable edged with steel. "Without consent, the museum's advertising it as hers." "Do you have proof of ownership?" "Every document." A brief sound, the click of a pen. "Then they had no legal right to transfer anything," Julian said. "I'll need scans, All of them. And a list of what's missing. They're ready, she said. Connor will send them tonight. Good. I'll reach out to the museum director first thing in the morning. Evelyn Drake, correct? Marlene's voice tightened. Yes. I know her. Too well. Julian's tone softened a degree, but only barely. Then let's remind her of the law. I'll call when I have their response. The line went dead with a crisp click. Marlene stared at the phone for a moment, her reflection faintly visible in the polished receiver. She looked older suddenly, but not smaller. If anything, her focus had sharpened. Connor sat across from her, the scanner light still pulsing faintly in the dark. What now? He asked. We wait, she said. Then, after a beat, and we watch. The next morning brought no calm. An email from the museum landed in Marlene's inbox before dawn. The message was curt. Clinical, almost. We acknowledge receipt of your inquiry. The museum accepted 22 works as a family donation, executed in good faith by Ms. Haley Whitcomb. All documentation appeared complete at the time of transfer. No apology. No acknowledgement of theft. Marlene's jaw set as she read it again. Family donation. As if the name itself gave them ownership. By noon, Julian had already followed up. He read the email aloud over speakerphone. Evelyn Drake seems unbothered, he said. Too unbothered. That means she knows exactly what she's done, and thinks you'll back down. She's wrong, Marlene said. I know, Julian replied. But she doesn't. Marlene rose from her chair, the wood creaking under her as she walked to the empty wall where her favorite painting, Evening on the Battery, once hung. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the bare glass left behind. She could almost see the painting there, the brush strokes she had memorized years ago. Get ready, Julian, she said softly. If they think I'll let this go quietly, they don't know who they're dealing with. Outside, the wind off Charleston Harbor rattled the windows, a low, hollow sound that made the whole house seem to hold its breath. And from her desk, the phone buzzed again. An unknown number flashing on the screen. Marlene hesitated only a second before answering. A calm, measured woman's voice drifted through the line. Mrs. Whitcomb? This is Evelyn Drake. I understand you've been asking questions. Marlene's lips curved into a thin, dangerous smile. Not asking, Ms. Drake, she said. Informing. The silence that followed was brief, but sharp enough to cut glass. 2 days later, the museum smelled like polish and money. Marlene hadn't been inside the Charleston City Museum in over a decade. Not since the renovations turned its marble lobby into something that looked more like an airport terminal than a sanctuary of art. She moved quietly through the entryway, her scarf pulled high around her jaw, her sunglasses covering the sharpness in her eyes. Her ticket was scanned by a cheerful young attendant who couldn't have been more than 20. Enjoy the Whitcomb collection, the girl said brightly, as though the name belonged to someone else entirely. Marlene's pulse thudded once, hard, but she smiled faintly and stepped through. The exhibit was housed in Gallery 4, tall ceilings, whitewashed walls, the kind of light that flattened every color just slightly. She stopped 3 feet inside the threshold. There they were, her paintings. The room tilted for a moment. She steadied herself on the railing beside a placard that read, The Whitcomb Collection, a gift to the city, donated by Haley Whitcomb. Her name wasn't there, not once. The first canvas on display, a delicate oil study she'd purchased in Boston twilight over Gloucester, hung crooked, half-shadowed by glare from the window. Below it, the label read, From the private holdings of the Whitcomb family, long cherished by generations of Charleston collectors. Marlene's throat constricted. Charleston collectors. They'd erased her singularity, turned her passion into some generic family heirloom narrative. 2 women passed behind her, stopping to admire the same painting. You can really feel the family history in these, one said softly. Isn't it wonderful that her granddaughter gave them to the city? Marlene didn't turn. She just adjusted her glasses and moved on. In the next alcove, the Evening on the Battery was hung, her favorite, except someone had rearranged the entire composition of the wall. It was now surrounded by lesser pieces that didn't belong to the same period, let alone the same theme. The flow was broken, the harmony shattered. It wasn't just theft, it was vandalism disguised as virtue. At the far end of the room, a young docent was explaining the collection to a small group of tourists. His voice carried in that reverent, practiced way that suggested he'd memorized the museum's press release. Ms. Haley Whitcomb wanted to ensure her family's legacy would live on, he said, gesturing toward a landscape that Marlene had bought directly from the artist 40 years ago. These works have been in her family for generations. She felt it was time to share them with Charleston. The crowd murmured in admiration. Marlene's grip tightened around her purse. For a second she thought she might say something. Correct him. Correct them all. But she caught herself. No. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The faint click of the camera broke the hush of the gallery. One photo, then another, then another. Every tag, every mislabeled placard, every misplaced frame. Documented. Evidence. She worked her way methodically through each room, ignoring the curious glances of staff. Her expression never wavered, calm as polished stone. When she finally stepped back into the sunlight, the city noise felt abrasive, too alive after that antiseptic quiet. The museum loomed behind her, proud and hollow. At the corner cafe across the street, a man in a charcoal jacket was already waiting. Peter Lorman looked exactly as she remembered. Broad-shouldered, graying at the temples, the kind of man who carried authority without needing to raise his voice. Marlene, he said as she approached, rising slightly from his chair out of respect. Didn't think I'd see you back in that building again. She gave a dry smile, sliding into the seat opposite him. Neither did I, but apparently, I have an exhibit now. Peter's brow furrowed. I heard something. Didn't believe it till I saw the brochure. Marlene set her phone on the table, the gallery photos still glowing on the screen. He leaned in, scanning through them in silence. Misattributed, badly hung, she said evenly. Half those tags are wrong. The Channing piece is upside down on the digital catalog. Peter whistled low. They really did butcher it. They did more than that. Her voice dropped. They erased me. For a long moment, the sounds of the cafe, cups clinking, doors swinging open, soft chatter, filled the silence between them. Then Marlene reached into her purse again and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. She slid it across the table. What's this? A list of every work that belongs to me. The pieces Haley transferred, 22 in total. Peter unfolded the page, his expression tightening as he read. You planning to sue? I already am, Marlene said. But that's just the legal side. I want them back. Intact. Quietly. Peter's eyes met hers. You want recovery. I want restoration, she corrected. On my terms. He studied her for a moment, really studied her, then nodded once. You know I don't do anything without paperwork. You'll have it soon, she said. Julian's preparing the filings. Peter leaned back, tapping the list against the table. All right, Marlene, when the time comes, you just say the word. I'll make sure every frame finds its way home. She looked past him, through the cafe window at the museum across the street, the sunlight gleaming off the glass like a dare. Oh, Peter, she murmured, a faint, dangerous calm in her voice. The time's coming faster than they think. And as the waiter approached with their coffee, her phone vibrated once more. Julian's name lighting the screen, followed by 2 words that made her eyes narrow. They responded. By morning. Charleston woke to headlines that made Marlene's stomach turn. Her phone buzzed nonstop, texts from former colleagues, students, even a neighbor who hadn't spoken to her in years. Each message came with the same link, the same photograph. Haley, radiant under the gallery lights, standing in front of Evening on the Battery. The article's title burned on the screen, "A Grand Gift. The Whitcomb Family Donates Priceless Art Collection to the City." Haley's smile was effortless, practiced, the kind of grin you wear when you think you've finally outgrown the shadow you came from. Her quote sat just beneath the photograph. "My grandmother inspired my love of art. I only hope to carry forward her legacy by sharing it with the world." Marlene read it 3 times, her jaw tightening until it ached. Her legacy. Her. Outside, gulls screamed over the harbor, the sound sharp and lonely. She didn't turn on the television, but she didn't have to. By noon, every local station replayed the segment. Haley in a pastel suit, her voice syrup smooth as she told Charleston what a privilege it was to give back to the community. "Each piece tells a story about family," Haley said on camera, her expression saintly. "About memory and belonging." Marlene muted the screen, the image freezing mid-smile. "Memory and belonging," she repeated under her breath, the words turning bitter on her tongue. She wouldn't know belonging if it bit her. The phone rang again. Julian. His tone was clipped, efficient. "I've drafted the notice. It'll be served by end of day." "Good," Marlene said. "Send a copy to me." "You'll like this one," he replied. "I made it impossible to misinterpret." Minutes later, the letter came through. Formal, uncompromising, notice of unlawful transfer and demand for return, to the Charleston City Museum and its director, Ms. Evelyn Drake. The undersigned Marlene Whitcomb retains sole and exclusive ownership of the 22 works currently displayed under the title, "The Whitcomb Collection, a Gift to the City." These works were transferred without consent or legal authority by Ms. Haley Whitcomb, who possessed no title nor right of conveyance. Immediate return of said works is required to avoid civil action. Marlene read it aloud once, then printed it, watching the ink soak slowly into the page. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn Drake's reply arrived. It wasn't written by a lawyer. It wasn't even carefully worded. "Mrs. Whitcomb, the museum accepted the donation in good faith from Ms. Whitcomb's granddaughter. All documentation appeared voluntary and complete. We have no reason to believe otherwise. Regards, Evelyn Drake, Director, Charleston City Museum." Marlene smiled. A cold, humorless thing. She knew exactly what Evelyn was doing. Stalling, pretending calm while calculating just how much she could get away with. But Marlene wasn't bluffing either. She forwarded the email to Julian, then called Peter. He answered on the first ring. "I saw the coverage," he said. No greeting, just a low, steady voice. "She's enjoying herself." "For now," Marlene said. "You still have that transport team?" "Of course. What are you thinking?" "Prelim paperwork, just in case." "Copy that. I'll keep it discreet." The words, "just in case," hung between them like an unspoken pact. Peter didn't press for more. He never did. That evening, Marlene sat in her study, the light fading around her. The walls still looked wounded, bare spots where her collection had once glowed with color and history. She traced the edges of one empty frame with her fingers, remembering every piece that had hung there, every purchase, every hour of curation, every brushstroke that had spoken to her over the years. The anger wasn't loud anymore, it was quiet, concentrated, cold as a blade. Her laptop chimed again, an alert from a local arts feed she followed out of habit. Another press release from the museum. She opened it, pulse steady now, eyes scanning the text. The Charleston City Museum celebrates the generosity of Ms. Haley Whitcomb, whose remarkable contribution marks a milestone in the city's artistic heritage. And below that, a quote from Evelyn herself. The Whitcomb family's gift reaffirms the importance of sharing private treasures with the public. True legacy lives in the act of giving. Marlene's hand hovered over the mouse. Then she clicked, save. Evidence. Every lie would have its place in the record. Connor called later that night, his voice hesitant. I saw the press release, he said. You okay? I'm fine, Marlene replied evenly. I'm making arrangements. For what? For the return of what's mine. She didn't elaborate, and Connor didn't ask. He could hear it in her tone, the quiet, deliberate certainty that meant she'd already crossed from indignation into action. Across town, under the soft buzz of the museum's security lights, workers adjusted placards, wiped glass, and polished the marble floors for a Friday reception. Haley's smiling face gleamed from the posters at the entrance, her name printed larger than life. But in Peter Lorman's small office above the harbor, a different kind of preparation was underway. He stacked empty transport crates, checked humidity controls, and logged serial numbers. Beside him, on the table, sat the list Marlene had given him. 22 lines, each one a promise. He looked at it for a long time before locking it in his cabinet. Back in her study, Marlene poured herself a glass of wine. She didn't toast, didn't smile, just watched the sky turn violet over the harbor and whispered, You wanted a legacy, Haley. Let's see if you can live with one built on theft. Then she shut her laptop, stood, and reached for her coat. The museum's invitation to the private reception was still on the counter. She picked it up, smoothed the edges, and read the date aloud. 2 weeks. Her reflection stared back from the window, calm, collected, quietly dangerous. 2 weeks, she repeated. That's when it ends. The sun barely touched the horizon when Marlene stood by her desk, watching the first legal notice come through her email. The words on the screen were sharp, clear, precise, and irrevocable. Julian had filed an emergency injunction with the county clerk. It was done. The court had granted immediate relief, ordering the return of all 22 works. Marlene read the notice twice, then set the phone down. She didn't feel the surge of victory she might have expected. It was just one step, a necessary one, but there was no time to bask in its satisfaction. Not yet. Across town, Peter Lorman was already making his way to the museum. His transport team had been cleared for authorized recovery, all legalities now in place, the steps forward inevitable. The museum wouldn't know what hit them. Peter moved like a man who had done this 1,000 times. He slipped through the back entrance of the museum, his team following him in silence. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, just the soft click of boots on polished floors as they made their way down the long hallways, past silent exhibits, and into the storage areas behind the gallery. The art was still there, hanging in the same place, behind the curtains of exhibit lights that still glowed under the museum's ceilings. A part of Marlene still hated the quiet chaos of it all, the way Haley's name seemed to bleed into every inch of the space, as though the pieces no longer belonged to her but to the lie. But that would end today. Peter's team began tagging the pieces, quietly numbering them, writing down every detail, every inch of provenance. The meticulous care they took reminded Marlene of the way she'd once hung these pieces herself. Exactly, carefully, so that each one told a story. She sat back in her chair, her fingers curling around the edge of the desk as the minutes ticked by. The museum was hosting a reception tonight, a private gala to celebrate Haley's so-called donation. Marlene couldn't help but smile darkly. She wasn't going to just reclaim her collection. She was going to take it back in the most public way imaginable. Her phone buzzed. It was Connor. I'm on my way to the museum with the court documents. They're expecting me. Marlene felt a momentary flutter in her chest. He was the last piece of this puzzle. He hadn't been involved until now, had kept his distance as much as possible, but this time, he was here, standing firm with her. "Good," she said. "Make sure Evelyn sees the order." "I'll make sure she does," Connor replied. "Just don't do anything crazy, okay?" Marlene smiled to herself, hearing the concern in his voice. "Nothing crazy. I'm just taking back what's mine." It was nearly time. Back at the museum, Haley's Instagram posts were lighting up the city. Photos of her on the red carpet, greeting the who's who of Charleston society, wearing that same smug smile Marlene had come to despise. She'd tagged the museum, tagged her own name, and even included hashtags like Skeen Whitcomb Collection and Ga Art for the People. Her followers, mostly influencers, socialites, and the occasional art enthusiast, had begun to repost her photos, each one gushing about the historic donation that was making waves in the art world. Marlene's jaw clenched, but she didn't let herself get distracted. She had waited too long to lose focus now. At the museum, Evelyn Drake stood by the entrance, her eyes flicking nervously toward the staff. She hadn't yet seen the court order, hadn't yet realized that everything was about to change. Marlene could almost feel the woman's anxiety from across town, but Evelyn wasn't the target tonight. No, tonight was Haley's moment. Marlene had arranged for the removal to take place in full view of the crowd, right under their noses, in the middle of the reception, while Haley was still basking in the spotlight. The museum's crowd would be at its most distracted, drinking wine, laughing, oblivious to the world falling apart around them. Marlene had spent hours setting this up, lining up the legal paperwork, coordinating the transport, and making sure everything was in place. The pieces would disappear, one by one, in a slow, methodical dance of legal force and undeniable power. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Peter. "We're in," he said. "We're tagging and moving. You're good to go." The words settled over Marlene like a wave. Everything was in motion now. Everything had been set into play. At the museum, Haley was giving her speech, her voice bright and confident. The crowd was clapping, the photographers clicking away, and for all the world, it seemed like her donation was a success. Then, right on cue, a low murmur swept through the crowd. Marlene wasn't there in person, but she could feel the ripple of confusion from 1,000 miles away. She could hear the whispers, the turning of heads, as the first piece of art was quietly, almost ceremoniously removed from the wall. Haley's smile faltered for just a split second, but only for a moment. She recovered quickly, but the unease was starting to sink in. Peter's voice came through her phone, steady and calm. "One down, one to go. It's working, Marlene. They can't stop us now." Marlene felt the first real satisfaction of the day. Sweet, sharp, a rush of relief. But she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. As Haley's voice continued to prattle on, Marlene finally leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. Tonight, she would watch Haley's prized legacy crumble, piece by piece. And when it was over, when her collection was back in its rightful place, no longer a pawn in Haley's game, Marlene would have the last laugh. But for now, she waited, listening to the faint sound of art being unhooked and taken away. And she smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's happening." Then, in the far distance, a single loud crash echoed through the night. The chandeliers over the Charleston City Museum's main hall glowed like captured moons, throwing light across champagne flutes and sequined gowns. The reception was at its peak. Laughter, clinking glassware, and the low hum of Charleston's elite basking in their own reflections. Haley Whitcomb stood near the podium, perfectly framed by the art that wasn't hers. She looked every bit the philanthropist, hair sculpted, smile photogenic, gown shimmering pale gold beneath the gallery lights. Cameras waited, journalists poised with pens in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies said, his voice buoyant, oblivious. "Please welcome the woman whose generosity made tonight possible, Ms. Haley Whitcomb." Applause erupted like a cue. Haley approached the mic, chin high, feigning humility with just enough grace to look authentic. She waited for the applause to settle, eyes scanning the crowd for admiration, adoration, whatever currency she was chasing tonight. "Thank you," she began, voice sweet but hollow. "This evening isn't about me, it's about legacy." Marlene was already there. She'd slipped through the side hall 10 minutes earlier, wearing her charcoal coat and a quiet expression that could have frozen steel. No one noticed her at first. Just another guest, perhaps, lingering by the doorway. But her eyes were fixed on the walls, on the paintings that had once lived within her home. Haley's voice echoed across the room, practiced and falsely tender. "My grandmother, Marlene Whitcomb, dedicated her life to art education and preservation. Her passion inspired me to ensure that our family's collection, her collection, would be shared with all of you." The lie hung in the air like perfume, too sweet to breathe. And then came the first sound, the subtle click of a frame being unlatched. It was faint, almost hidden beneath the applause. But Marlene heard it. She turned her head slightly toward the corridor where Peter's team had begun their work. They moved in quiet precision, 3 uniformed handlers, each with identification badges from the transport service authorized by the injunction. One by one, the paintings began to come down, carefully, methodically. The crowd didn't notice at first. They were too focused on Haley, too wrapped in her performance. "Art," Haley continued, "is memory made visible. And what better way to honor my grandmother's life than to preserve it here, in the heart of Charleston?" The second click was louder. A few heads turned. Haley hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing toward the sound before regaining her composure. "She always told me." Then came the third frame, unhooked with quiet finality. A worker passed directly behind her with a wrapped canvas in hand. A whisper rippled through the audience. "What's happening?" someone murmured. Haley blinked, still smiling for the cameras. Her voice faltered. She glanced toward Evelyn Drake, who stood near the edge of the room, pale beneath her composure. Evelyn's gaze darted toward the men removing the paintings, then to the uniformed courier now unfolding paperwork beside her. The murmur grew louder. Marlene stepped forward. Her heels struck the marble floor with calm, deliberate rhythm as she emerged fully into the light. Her silver hair caught the glow from the chandeliers, her eyes, sharp and unreadable, locked on Haley. "Grandmother," Haley said, her voice cracking around the word. What are you doing here?" Marlene didn't answer. She stopped halfway between the podium and the nearest wall, her gaze moving from one empty space to another as each painting disappeared into the waiting crates. Peter appeared behind her, clipboard in hand, speaking quietly with the museum staffer. Every movement was sanctioned, every piece accounted for. The audience watched in suspended confusion, torn between scandal and fascination. Evelyn Drake took an uncertain step forward. "Excuse me, this is a private event." Peter cut her off with quiet authority. "We have a court order, Ms. Drake, signed by the county clerk this morning." He handed her a copy, the embossed seal catching the light. "Effective immediately, the works are to be returned to their rightful owner, Mrs. Marlene Whitcomb." The words landed like glass breaking. Cameras turned, snapping photos not of Haley, but of Marlene. The real story had just entered the frame. Haley gripped the edge of the podium, her polished confidence unraveling in real time. "That's ridiculous," she said, voice trembling despite her attempt at poise. "This is a misunderstanding." Is it? Marlene's voice was low, calm, but it carried easily. Because I read the labels, dear. You gave away what you never owned. Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Even the band had gone silent. Haley's composure cracked. You can't just... But another painting came down behind her, the sound of its frame sliding free like punctuation to the moment. She spun toward it, eyes wide. Stop that! No one listened. Peter's team worked with quiet efficiency, their motions clean and professional, the kind of precision that made it impossible to mistake this for anything other than what it was: a reclamation. Marlene walked closer, stopping just beside the stage. You said this was about legacy, she said softly. You were right. It's about mine. Haley stood frozen, her speech crumpled in her hand, her image unraveling as the cameras turned their lenses away. Behind her, the once proud wall of paintings was nearly bare. The applause that had opened the evening was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, an elegant, brutal justice hanging in the air. Then, faintly, from somewhere in the back of the hall, a single guest began to clap. Slowly, deliberately. Haley's head jerked toward the sound, panic flickering in her eyes. Marlene didn't look away. The moment stretched like wire until the lights dimmed slightly and the crew wheeled out the final crate, the largest of them all. Haley whispered something. Maybe, please. Maybe stop. But her words drowned beneath the hum of cameras and the low, rhythmic scrape of a crate closing. Marlene turned, her voice calm, almost tender. Finish your speech, Haley, she said. The part about preserving history. And then she walked out, the applause starting again. Not for Haley this time, but for the woman who'd taken back her name. Outside, under the flickering museum lights, Peter met her at the curb, nodding once. It's done. Marlene looked back at the glowing building, hearing the chaos erupt inside. Her expression didn't change. No, she said quietly. It's just beginning. The room had gone deathly silent, save for the faint, steady sound of the remaining paintings being lifted from their frames. A murmur rippled through the guests as the walls slowly, inexorably, went bare. The soft click of a frame's edge against the canvas reverberated across the cavernous hall, a reminder of how swiftly Marlene had dismantled Haley's illusion. Haley's words were lost in the silence. She stood motionless behind the podium, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to applaud or flee. The air felt thicker now, charged with tension that had shifted from celebration to something darker. Evelyn Drake stood by the door, her fingers gripping the edge of a glass, her perfectly composed face finally betraying something close to panic. She took a step forward, her heels sharp against the floor as she approached Peter and his crew. Stop this! Stop this now! Evelyn snapped, her voice rising with the kind of brittle authority that had once commanded rooms. Peter didn't look up from the crates he was overseeing, the last of the artwork already carefully wrapped. Instead, he handed her the court order. His fingers were calm, deliberate. This is the official notice, Ms. Drake. Mrs. Whitcomb is reclaiming her property. Evelyn stared at the document for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. She glanced over her shoulder at Haley, who was still frozen by the podium, her body tense like a string about to snap. Evelyn turned back to Peter, fury flashing in her eyes, but her voice was shaky. This is a mistake. You can't do this without legal approval. I won't let you destroy this event. It's not a destruction, Ms. Drake, Peter replied smoothly. It's a restoration. Behind him, the final crate clicked shut, the lid settling with finality. The gallery, once vibrant with art, now stood bare, its walls marked only by the faint outline of what had once been. Haley's eyes, wide with disbelief, locked onto Marlene as she moved toward the door, walking calmly, her pace slow but sure, as if every step was part of a carefully executed plan. The sound of her heels against the marble floor cut through the air like a metronome, its rhythm steady, unhurried. "Grandmother," Haley's voice cracked, low and desperate. "Why are you doing this?" Marlene didn't stop. She didn't even turn to face her. "Because I built it," she said softly, her voice firm and cutting through the haze of confusion. "You stole it." Haley's breath hitched as if the words were a physical blow. She started toward Marlene, her steps fast, too fast, her heels clicking unevenly, the stiletto's sharp noise like the sound of desperation. "You're making a mistake," she called out, her voice rising, frantic now. "You've always been so obsessed with this collection. It's mine, Grandma. I did this for us, for the family. You don't know how hard I worked." Marlene reached the door, one hand outstretched to the polished handle. She didn't look back as Haley's voice cracked in the distance. "Don't leave me like this, please." "I'm not leaving you, Haley," Marlene said, her tone cold and cutting. She turned just enough to meet Haley's gaze. "I'm simply taking back what's mine." As Marlene pushed the door open, the weight of the moment shifted. Outside, the evening air was sharp with the lingering tang of salt from the harbor, the first stirrings of wind ruffling her coat. She stepped out into the cool night, her chest still steady, her mind sharp with satisfaction. The sound of chaos inside seemed to grow, like a wave swelling beneath the museum's gleaming exterior. Connor appeared at her side almost immediately, his tall figure a quiet presence in the dim light. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed his relief. He'd been watching, waiting, as the pieces fell into place. The music, the clinking of glasses, the whispers of scandal, all of it now belonging to Haley, no longer a backdrop to Marlene's quiet strength. "Is it done?" Connor asked softly, his voice low, barely audible over the commotion inside. Marlene glanced at him and nodded. "It's done." Before either of them could speak again, the door to the museum swung open behind them. Haley appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, her hands trembling slightly as they rested against the doorframe. "You won't get away with this," she said, her voice barely more than a hiss. "This isn't over." Marlene's gaze remained steady. "No, Haley," she said, her words firm. "It's your legacy that's over." Connor looked at Marlene, then back at Haley, his expression unreadable. A thin smile played at the edge of his lips, but he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The door slammed shut with a hollow thud, cutting off the last vestiges of the evening's grandeur. In the silence that followed, Marlene finally allowed herself to take a deep breath, the weight of the night lifting slightly. But as they walked away from the museum, footsteps echoing in the cool night air, Marlene knew this was only the beginning. The true battle, the one that would define her legacy, was still to come. And Haley wasn't the only one who would have to live with the consequences. The morning headlines were merciless. Donor drama at museum gala. Grandmother reclaims collection mid-reception. Art heist in reverse. Ownership dispute. Rock City's cultural elite. The accompanying photos told the story better than words could. Haley, frozen mid-speech, eyes wide. Marlene, calm and poised beside the crates. Evelyn Drake standing helpless as Peter's crew methodically cleared the walls. By noon, the museum's official Instagram page had disabled comments. Not quickly enough, though. Thousands of replies had already flooded the posts. Unbelievable. Fraud in sequins. Justice served live. Haley's own feed went silent. The posts from the gala, her bright smile, her rehearsed captions about heritage and preserving legacy, vanished one by one. Her profile photo disappeared too, replaced by the default silhouette, as if she had erased herself before anyone else could. But the internet has a long memory. Screenshots were already circulating, stitched together by bloggers and local art forums dissecting every frame of the now infamous reception. Every angle of humiliation immortalized. Meanwhile, inside the Charleston City Museum, panic wore the scent of espresso and expensive perfume. Staff moved quietly, heads down. The director's office, once a place of smug composure, was now a war room. Evelyn Drake's voice carried down the corridor, brittle and tense. "I told you to vet the provenance," she hissed into the phone. "I don't care if she's family. You verify ownership before accepting a multi-million-dollar donation." But donors had already begun to withdraw. One by one, emails came through announcing temporary suspensions of funding. The city's wealthiest patrons didn't like scandal, especially not the kind that trended on national news. By mid-afternoon, the museum's PR team sent out a vague statement about an internal review of recent events. It fooled no one. Across town, in the quiet hum of Marlene's study, order was returning. Peter had already called that morning. "All 22 pieces secured," he said. "Climate-controlled, insured, and cataloged. Every frame untouched." "Good," Marlene replied, her voice even. "Keep them off the books until I say otherwise." She stood by the window as he spoke, looking out toward the harbor where gulls drifted low across the gray water. The city was waking to a new version of the truth, one she had forced it to see. Connor arrived not long after, holding his phone loosely in one hand. "You should see this," he said. He handed her the device. On the screen, a single image posted to his small, unassuming social media account. It showed her provenance documents laid neatly across her desk, the signatures crisp and unmistakable. The caption read only, "Truth has paperwork." No hashtags, no tags, just quiet precision. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. Art professors, collectors, even attorneys reposted it. Marlene didn't need to go viral. Her evidence did that for her. The messages started pouring in that evening, first from former colleagues at the university. "Proud of you, Marlene. Always knew you had fight left in you." Then from an old gallery owner in Savannah. "That's how you handle thieves, with grace and documentation." Even her late husband's best friend called to say, "She underestimated the wrong woman." Marlene read them all, smiled faintly at a few, but didn't reply. This wasn't about vindication. Not yet. On her dining table, the papers were stacked in careful order. Insurance documents, chain of ownership files, Julian's formal complaint drafts. The logistics of justice. She wasn't celebrating. She was strategizing. Connor leaned against the doorway, watching her sort through the folders. "You really aren't going to take a victory lap, huh?" Marlene glanced up at him. "Victory laps are for people who think the race is over." He smiled softly. "You don't think it is?" "Oh no," she said, sliding another folder into place. "Haley hasn't learned anything yet. And Evelyn Drake still has my name printed on those exhibit flyers." Connor hesitated, then nodded, sensing the calm storm gathering beneath her composure. "Julian's sending something over tonight," he said. "He mentioned an offer." "An offer?" "From the museum," Connor replied. "Apparently they'd like to rectify the misunderstanding quietly." Marlene didn't look up from the table. They're not capable of quiet. The house was silent except for the rustle of paper and the steady hum of the dehumidifier Peter had installed to protect the paintings. Each crate stood lined up along the far wall, rows of reclaimed memory, sealed and waiting. The scent of varnish and cedar filled the air, familiar and grounding. Marlene stepped closer to the first crate and brushed her hand along its smooth wooden edge. The label read, "Property of Marlene Whitcomb, Verified Collection." The black lettering gleamed under the lamplight. Peter's voice from earlier echoed in her mind. "Every frame finds its way home." And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. Not pride, not triumph, just quiet clarity. But then her phone buzzed again. A new email. Subject line: Proposal, Charleston City Museum. Julian had forwarded it with a note. They're trying to save face. You'll want to see this. Marlene opened the attachment. The museum's letterhead gleamed at the top of the page, followed by a single paragraph. We hope to discuss a compromise, co-attribution of the Whitcomb collection, with shared recognition for both donor and original curator. Her lips curved into a smile, faint and cold. She set the letter down, the faint sound of the paper brushing the table like the whisper of a blade. They want my name back, she murmured, but only if they can keep theirs beside it. Connor looked up, reading her expression. What are you going to do? Marlene turned toward the crates, her reflection caught in the polished glass of the nearest frame. Decide, she said, how much of this city deserves to remember the truth. Outside, thunder rolled low over the harbor, a storm pushing in from the Atlantic. It rattled the windows as if on cue, and Marlene smiled to herself, steady, unshaken, as the first drops began to fall. 9. The deal they didn't get. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Charleston's cobblestones gleamed slick and black, reflecting street lamps like melted gold. Inside Marlene's house, the steady patter against the windows was the only sound, until the phone rang. Julian's voice was calm, but there was something sharper beneath it. They want a meeting. Marlene didn't need to ask who they were. Of course they do. It'll be Evelyn. She's framing it as a discussion, but it's a salvage operation. You want me there? No, Marlene said, reaching for her coat. I want her to look me in the eye when she loses. The Charleston City Museum looked different under gray skies, stripped of its grandeur, the marble facade damp and dull. Inside, the lights felt too bright, too eager to suggest normalcy. Evelyn Drake waited in her office, her posture precise as a painting on loan. Marlene, she said, rising from her chair. You look well. Better than your press coverage, Marlene replied evenly, removing her gloves. Evelyn's smile flickered. We both know that spectacle did neither of us any favors. It wasn't a spectacle, Marlene corrected. It was a correction. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them, the soft hum of the dehumidifier, the faint tick of the office clock. Then Evelyn gestured to a manila folder on the table. I have a proposal. Marlene stayed standing. You've had several. This one's different. Evelyn folded her hands. The museum board wants to feature a permanent installation in honor of Marlene Whitcomb. You'd have your own placard, a plaque, maybe a small corner of the gallery dedicated to your work and teaching career, and in exchange, we'd keep using my name on the donation, Marlene interrupted. Evelyn hesitated. It's standard for attribution continuity. Standard for revisionism, Marlene countered. You're offering to share credit for my collection with the woman who stole it. Evelyn sighed. Haley made a mistake, an impulsive, foolish one. But if we tear her name from the exhibit entirely, the board looks negligent. We both know that's not the outcome either of us wants. Marlene finally sat, crossing one leg over the other, calm as a judge. You misunderstand me, Evelyn. That's exactly the outcome I want. The director's composure cracked for the first time. Marlene, be reasonable. You've already won. The art is yours again. What's left to gain? Marlene leaned forward, her voice low. The truth. Without compromise. Without an asterisk. When Evelyn didn't respond, Marlene stood. We're done here. She walked to the door before pausing. And Evelyn? She added, her tone soft but lethal. Next time you want to attach my name to your exhibits, make sure you can afford it. The next morning, Julian's letter went out. Formal, scathing, and public. Effective immediately, Mrs. Whitcomb revokes all permissions for the use, mention, or implication of her name, image, or family connection in any Charleston City Museum materials, programming, or marketing. Any future association will be regarded as defamatory misrepresentation. By noon, the letter had been leaked to the press. The museum scrambled to issue statements, but no spin could hide the desperation in their tone. That afternoon, Marlene sat in her study, reviewing Julian's draft of a potential gallery partnership proposal, her own show, independent and untainted. Connor watched from the doorway, hands tucked into his pockets. "You're really doing it?" Marlene looked up, her glasses low on her nose. "Doing what?" "Rebuilding it. The way you always meant to." She allowed herself a small smile. "You think anyone will come? After what you just pulled?" He laughed softly. "They'll line up around the block." Marlene hesitated, studying the plans spread across the table. Floor layouts, lighting schemes, insurance quotes. "It's strange," she murmured. "It feels less like revenge now. More like repair." Connor nodded. "You should call Peter. He'll want to help." And of course, Peter did. When she told him what she was planning, a private reopening, limited viewing, complete control of curation, he didn't even let her finish before saying, "Transport's on me." "Peter, that's not necessary." "It is," he said simply. "You remind people what real ownership looks like. Least I can do is make sure it gets there safe." Marlene smiled, the kind that reached her eyes this time. "Then I'll owe you a front row seat." "You already paid for that," Peter said, "the night you walked out of that museum." A week later, as Marlene cataloged the final pieces, her hands steady now, her pen looping across inventory sheets, Julian called again. "I thought you'd like to hear it from me before you see it online," he said. "What now?" "Haley's been dropped from the Charleston Arts Advancement Board. Quietly, of course, but it's official." Marlene stilled, her pen hovering above the page. "On what grounds?" "Breach of trust and ethical misconduct." The chair didn't mince words. A slow breath escaped her. She hadn't needed to lift a finger for that part. Connor walked in just as she hung up. "Good news?" he asked. Marlene looked down at the stack of inventories, her collection, her history, her proof, and smiled faintly. "Justice," she said, and it didn't even have to shout. Outside, the storm had finally passed. The late light poured through the windows, gilding the edges of each reclaimed frame. For the first time, the house felt full again, not just of art, but of purpose. And yet, as Marlene reached for the next piece on her list, she paused, because something in her gut whispered that Charleston wasn't done watching her story unfold. The city that had once applauded Haley's theft was now whispering Marlene's name again, this time with awe. She set her pen down, her voice quiet but resolute. "Let them watch," she said. Then she turned to the next crate and lifted the lid, revealing a painting no one had seen in 20 years. Its colors still luminous, untouched by time. The kind of beauty, she thought, that doesn't ask for permission anymore. The storm passed, but the noise didn't. By the next week, the art world had turned Charleston's scandal into a parable. Every blog, every podcast, every glossy digital column had its version of "the woman who took her art back." One headline dominated them all. "Donor caught misrepresenting inheritance. The Whitcomb scandal redefines museum ethics." The accompanying image was Haley's, taken from that fateful night. Her expression caught mid-panic, eyes wide, mouth open, the microphone still in her hand. Beneath it, the subheading, "The art wasn't hers, the lie was." Comment sections were brutal. Words like entitled, manipulative, social climber were thrown around with careless venom. The museum issued another half-hearted apology, citing administrative oversight. But everyone knew better. The damage wasn't just public, it was cultural. Haley Whitcomb, once Charleston's social media darling, had gone dark. No new posts, no stories, no interviews. Her friends unfollowed her one by one. The influencer accounts that once praised her vision quietly deleted every mention of her name. Silence, Marlene thought, was the loudest punishment of all. She sat in her study, the morning light filtering through lace curtains, bathing her desk in pale gold. The air smelled of cedar and varnish. The house hummed with the soft rhythm of order, the collection, once stolen, now catalogued and secure. She was reviewing the last shipment form when she heard the knock at the door. It was Connor. He looked older somehow, his usual reserve tempered by something heavier. Regret. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his voice quiet. "You have a minute?" Marlene gestured to the armchair across from her. "Always." He sat, exhaling slowly. "I should have stopped her." "You didn't know what she'd do," Marlene replied, still sorting through papers. "I knew enough," he said, eyes fixed on the floor. "She talked about it, about making a name for herself, about you holding everything too tightly." Marlene stopped writing. The silence between them stretched long enough for the clock on the mantel to tick 3 times. When she finally spoke, her tone was even, not cold. "And you thought she was right?" Connor shook his head. "No. I just thought if I stayed quiet, it would pass. I didn't think she'd actually go through with it. I should have said something." He looked up at her then, eyes filled with something raw and real. "I'm sorry, Grandma. For the silence. For letting it get that far." Marlene regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she set her pen down, folded her hands and said, "I accept your apology." Connor blinked, surprised by her calmness. "But," she continued, "no more silence next time. Ever." He nodded once, the promise landing heavy in the air between them. "You have my word." "Good," she said. "That's all I need." Outside, the rumble of an approaching truck broke the stillness. Marlene stood, looking out the window as Peter's transport van pulled into the drive. Moments later, Peter himself stepped through the door, wiping rain off his jacket. "Last of it," he said with a grin. "The small pieces from storage. Every inch accounted for." He nodded toward the crates his crew carried inside, 2 smaller boxes marked with her handwriting. Marlene walked over and placed her hand on the nearest crate. "You've done more than enough, Peter." "Can't let my favorite client down," he said, his grin softening. "You're the reason I still believe this business has any soul left." She smiled faintly. "That makes one of us." As he and his team unloaded the final pieces, Connor helped unwrap a small painting, a minimalist study of color and texture, nothing famous, but deeply personal. Marlene had bought it with her first teaching paycheck. Seeing it again felt like meeting an old friend. "Hang this one here," she said quietly, pointing to the wall above her writing desk. "I want to see it while I work." Peter nodded. "You got it." When they were finished, Marlene signed the final delivery slip and handed it back. "Thank you, Peter." He tipped his head. "Anytime, Mrs. Whitcomb. You know where to find me." The house settled again once they left. Quiet. Whole. For the first time in months, the collection was complete. As she sat down, her computer pinged. A new email. The sender's name caught her off guard. Samantha R., museum intern. The message was short. Just 2 lines. "Mrs. Whitcomb, I was in the gallery the night you took it back. You probably didn't notice me, but I'll never forget it. You're a legend." Marlene stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. Not the cold satisfaction she'd worn for weeks, but something quieter. almost wistful. Legend, she murmured, tasting the word like a sip of old wine. Not yet. Her gaze shifted to the open sketchpad beside her, a rough plan for her new exhibition. The top of the page bore a title in her neat handwriting: Restoration, a Study in Ownership. She picked up her pencil, drew the first line, and whispered to herself, "Now, we begin again." But before she could continue, her phone vibrated, Julian's name flashing across the screen. She answered. "Yes?" His voice was low, cautious. "You should know. There's chatter that Haley's hired counsel. She's challenging your mental capacity during the injunction." Marlene stilled, pencil hovering over paper. The silence in the room grew taut again. "Let her," she said finally. "She's about to learn how sharp clarity can be." And with that, she went back to her sketch pad, the faint sound of graphite on paper steady and precise as the rain beginning again outside. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, thin, embossed, and far too polite for what it contained. Haley's legal counsel had filed a petition questioning Marlene's mental competency during the injunction process, alleging undue influence, confusion, and possible cognitive decline. Marlene read it once, then again. Her first reaction wasn't anger, it was exhaustion. Across the desk, Julian Cross adjusted his glasses and said quietly, "It's a reach. She's gambling on the optics, hoping the court will entertain it long enough to humiliate you." Marlene's gaze didn't waver. "Then let's end it fast." Julian smiled faintly, a shark's grin hidden beneath professionalism. "Already working on it. I've scheduled an independent evaluation. Dr. Crane, state-certified, unimpeachable record. Once we file her report, this challenge dies on arrival." "Good," Marlene said, slipping the letter back into its envelope. "If Haley wants to test my sanity, she's about to get her answer." The evaluation took place 2 mornings later in a quiet Charleston office lined with books and faintly scented with lemon polish. Dr. Crane was a small woman with clear eyes and the kind of warmth that made it hard to lie to her, even if one wanted to. She began gently. "Do you know why you're here, Mrs. Whitcomb?" Marlene folded her hands in her lap. "Because my granddaughter mistook clarity for instability." Dr. Crane smiled. "Fair enough." They talked for nearly 2 hours, about Marlene's teaching years, her career, her collection, each piece, its story, its provenance. About her late husband, her grief, and her sharp memory of every auction, every acquisition. When the conversation turned to Haley, Marlene didn't flinch. "She has charm without backbone," she said evenly, "which is dangerous in Charleston. People mistake it for character." Dr. Crane only nodded and wrote something in her notes. By the time the session ended, Marlene stood, smoothing her coat. "So, doctor, am I crazy enough for her liking?" Dr. Crane chuckled softly. "Mrs. Whitcomb, I'd trust you to remember the Federalist Papers verbatim if we lost the Library of Congress." The hearing came a week later. Charleston County Courthouse, oak-paneled and humid despite the air conditioning. Reporters loitered outside like gulls waiting for scraps. Haley sat at the petitioner's table, her posture rigid, eyes flicking to the cameras. She'd traded pastel ambition for courtroom beige, but the entitlement still gleamed through the cracks. Julian whispered to Marlene, "No grandstanding. Let the paperwork speak." Marlene nodded. "I plan to." When the judge entered, a man in his 60s with the patient weariness of someone who'd seen every kind of stupidity the city could muster. The room quieted. He read briefly through the documents, then turned his gaze toward Haley's counsel. "You're alleging your 74-year-old grandmother lacked the cognitive ability to understand legal documents she herself commissioned, signed, and executed through licensed professionals?" Haley's lawyer cleared his throat. "We believe." The judge held up a hand. You believe wrong. Laughter rippled faintly through the gallery before he continued. Dr. Crane's report is exhaustive. Mrs. Whitcomb not only passed every evaluative measure, she corrected the examiner's citation of an 18th century painter. That's not incompetence. That's expertise. Haley shifted in her seat, eyes darting downward. The judge turned toward her. Ms. Whitcomb, the court finds your claim baseless and, frankly, offensive. Filing a challenge like this wastes time, money, and credibility. Consider this your warning. Frivolous legal action will have consequences. Haley's lawyer began to object, but one look from the bench silenced him. Dismissed with prejudice, the judge said firmly, slamming the gavel once. Mrs. Whitcomb, you're free to go. And may I say, I wish my memory were half as sharp. Marlene inclined her head politely. Thank you, Your Honor. As she stood to leave, she caught Haley's gaze, pale, defiant, but flickering at the edges. Marlene gave her a single, almost pitying nod. Next time, she said softly, try the truth. That evening, back home, the front porch smelled of magnolia and salt. A delivery box sat on the step. Pink ribbon, no card. Inside, a cake, frosted white with looping chocolate script, certified sane, certified savage. Marlene laughed for the first time in weeks. A real, unguarded laugh that startled even her. There was only one person who'd send something like that. She texted her sister 2 words. You know me. From across the room, Connor grinned. Aunt Lindsay strikes again? She never misses, Marlene said, slicing a small piece. Sweet and cutting. Like family. The next morning, Peter stopped by. He carried something long and flat under one arm, wrapped in brown paper. For you, he said, handing it over. Marlene peeled back the paper and froze. It was the court order. Professionally printed, mounted, and framed in mahogany. Beneath it, engraved on a small brass plate. The law agrees, she was right. She looked up at him, touched. Peter, you didn't have to. I wanted to, he said simply. You earned that frame. He hung it beside her collection log, perfectly level, the gold seal catching the morning light. As he stepped back to admire it, Marlene felt something rare and unfamiliar settle over her. A quiet peace, the kind that came not from victory, but from vindication. Peter gave a low whistle. Looks right where it belongs. It does, she said softly. Outside, the world was bright again, the storm long gone, the air smelling faintly of sea salt and new beginnings. But even as she smiled, a flicker of curiosity crossed her mind, a name Julian had mentioned briefly before court adjourned. The Charleston Arts Council had called him. They wanted to meet about her next move. Marlene glanced at the framed order one last time and whispered, Let's see if they're finally ready to listen. Then she turned toward her desk, where the first sketch of her own exhibition waited, and began to plan the terms of her next masterpiece. The Charleston Arts Council meeting came and went, and with it, the last traces of negotiation. They hadn't wanted to talk about the museum, or Haley, or even the scandal that had turned into a local legend. They wanted to talk about preservation, about legacy. It was that word, the one Haley had twisted, that led Marlene to her decision. 2 weeks later, on a cool morning that smelled of rain-soaked jasmine, she sat at the long oak table in Julian's downtown office, a steaming cup of black coffee beside her. Her papers were stacked neatly, each signature line waiting like a final note in a song she'd been composing her entire life. Julian adjusted his cufflinks, then tapped the top page. The Whitcomb Preservation Trust, he said. Once this is filed, your collection becomes legally untouchable. Every piece accounted for, every stipulation binding. Marlene nodded, eyes steady on the pages. And the terms? He flipped through the folder, his tone methodical. Connor Whitcomb, successor trustee. joint administration with the Charleston Art Foundation to oversee conservation and scholarship. No transfer, sale, or donation of any work without direct consent from the trust. Marlene smiled faintly. No loopholes. None, Julian assured. Not even for family. Her pen hovered over the first page. Good, she signed. The sound of the nib against paper was soft, deliberate, final. When she finished, she leaned back, studying the documents as if they were another one of her curated pieces. Each clause had weight, precision, a composition of control and clarity. Julian watched her for a moment. You realize, of course, this means no one, not even Connor, can lend, exhibit, or donate anything without the trust's explicit authorization. That's the point, she said, capping her pen. I've seen what happens when people confuse possession with purpose. The art stays with those who respect it, not those who want to be seen owning it. Julian smiled just slightly. A hard line. I admire it. It's not a hard line, Marlene corrected. It's protection. I'm just doing for the collection what I should have done for myself sooner. By afternoon, the trust was sealed, digitally, legally, and irrevocably. Connor met her at the office door afterward, his expression cautious but proud. You really did it, he said. I did, Marlene replied. And you're part of it. His brow furrowed. Part of it? Your successor trustee, she said, handing him a copy of the papers. You'll work with the foundation to preserve everything exactly as it is. You'll make sure the collection lives beyond us, but never leaves us. Connor looked stunned. Grandma, I don't know if I'm... You are, she interrupted. You know the work. You know me. That's all you need. He looked down at the folder, his voice quiet. Haley's going to hate this. Marlene smiled without looking up. She already does. A week later, 2 unmarked wooden crates left her home on the Battery in a nondescript delivery van. They were bound for a small liberal arts college in North Carolina, a place no one in Charleston's upper circles ever mentioned, but whose art department Marlene had quietly funded years ago. Inside those crates were 2 mid-century pieces from her collection. Valuable, yes, but chosen for meaning, not market. She sent them anonymously, with a simple note typed on plain paper. For students who understand art belongs to those who study it, not those who claim it. When the registrar called Julian's office to confirm the donation, he simply replied, "The benefactor wishes to remain uncredited." Marlene never mentioned it to Connor, or to anyone else. Some parts of legacy, she thought, were best left unspoken. The rest of the collection she kept close. The most valuable pieces, her 3 19th-century moderns and the Channing landscape, were rehung in her study, locked behind reinforced glass and insured for more than any Charleston mansion was worth. Each frame had its tag, property of the Whitcomb Preservation Trust. On her desk, a small, freshly notarized addendum to her will sat folded beneath her hand. The ink had barely dried when she whispered the clause aloud, testing its sound. No heirs may donate, sell, or display any portion of the Whitcomb collection without written consent of the Trust's governing board. She underlined no heirs once for emphasis before sliding the page into the envelope. When Julian returned later that week, he filed the documents at the county clerk's office personally. The trust became public record, immutable, indestructible, final. As he left, he said, "It's done. They can fight ghosts if they like. But this can't be undone." "Good," Marlene said quietly, gazing at the rows of paintings lining her walls. "It's about time something in this city stayed where it belongs." That night, the house glowed softly, her study lit by the warm hue of the lamps. The gold seals on the trust papers shimmered faintly on her desk. Connor stopped by with takeout, 2 steaming containers of gumbo and cornbread. He watched her as she worked, her pen gliding across fresh notes for her exhibition proposal. "You're building something new again," he said. She didn't look up. No, she said. I'm preserving what's true. As she spoke, thunder rolled once more across the harbor, distant but steady. Marlene looked toward the window, the reflection of her paintings glowing back at her in the glass. Let them rewrite their stories if they want, she murmured. They won't touch mine again. And outside, beneath the restless Charleston sky, a single museum banner still fluttered in the wind, its old title barely visible through the rain. By morning, that banner would be gone. The letter arrived in a thick cream envelope, the kind that pretends to carry importance. The museum's embossed seal glinted faintly in the morning light as Marlene slid it open with her letter opener, the metal catching a small, cruel gleam. Inside, 3 paragraphs of apology that managed to say nothing at all. We regret the misunderstandings of the past months. The museum hopes to restore mutual goodwill and recognizes Mrs. Whitcomb's role in the preservation of cultural heritage. It was written in Evelyn Drake's careful, self-protective language. Every sentence crafted to avoid blame, every phrase meant to sound conciliatory without surrendering control. Marlene read it once, then again, her eyes moving more slowly the second time, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to feel the weight of its hollow courtesy. Then she folded the letter neatly, set it in the empty fireplace, and struck a match. The paper caught fast. For a moment the words glowed blue and gold before curling inward, the edges blackening until all that remained was a fragile drift of ash. She didn't bother to watch it burn completely. The next day her house came alive again, not with lawyers or reporters, but with laughter, soft conversation, and the gentle shuffle of shoes on hardwood floors. The Whitcomb Preservation Trust's first private exhibit had opened, not in a museum, but in her own home. No velvet ropes, no glossy donor plaques, just people who had loved art for the right reasons. Students from her years teaching at the university mingled with local artists, old friends, and a few journalists who'd earned her trust. A simple white card beside the door read, "Private viewing, the Whitcomb Collection, restored." Connor moved through the room with quiet grace, acting as informal curator, introducing each painting the way his grandmother once had, with reverence. "This piece," he said, gesturing toward a soft-toned oil of marshlands at dusk, "was bought at auction in '86. Grandma saved for it all year. The artist was forgotten then. He isn't now." The guests listened intently, their faces lit by the amber lamplight. At the far end of the room, Peter stood near the Channing landscape, hands clasped behind his back, smiling faintly. "Never thought I'd see it hung the way she always intended," he said to Julian, who nodded in agreement. Julian added quietly, "The court order might have made it legal, but this," he gestured around the room, "this made it right." Marlene moved through the crowd without fanfare, greeting guests with a touch on the arm or a knowing smile. Her hair caught the glow from the sconces, silver strands gleaming like threads of light. She stopped by the grand piano, her makeshift podium for the evening, and lifted her glass. The room stilled. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying easily. "Not for coming to see what was reclaimed, but for remembering what was never lost." The applause that followed was soft, restrained, respectful. Exactly the kind she valued. Connor cleared his throat. "There's one more thing," he said, glancing at her. She gave a small nod, the cue to continue. He turned back to the guests. "You all know what happened. You've read it, watched it, probably talked about it more than once. But what you might not know is this. These paintings weren't just possessions. They were proof." He gestured to the walls around them. "Proof that curation isn't about ownership or credit. It's about care. My grandmother built this collection piece by piece, with no thought of fame. And when someone tried to steal her name, she reminded this city who the real curator was. A low murmur of appreciation spread through the crowd. Someone clapped, then another. Later that night, a local arts critic published his column online. It began with one sentence that Charleston would quote for years: "The real curator was never in doubt." When the last guest left and the lights dimmed, Marlene lingered beside her favorite work, Evening on the Battery. The brushstrokes shimmered faintly in the low light, the tide frozen in a permanent golden hour. She stood there for a long moment, her reflection layered over the painting's surface like a ghost from its own history. Connor approached quietly. "You did it," he said softly. Marlene smiled, though her eyes stayed on the canvas. "No," she said. "We did." Outside, Charleston was quiet, the harbor breeze drifting through the open window, carrying the faint scent of salt and magnolia. Peter came in briefly to say goodbye. "You sure you don't want me to stick around to help lock up?" Marlene waved him off. "Go home, Peter. You've earned your rest." He smiled, touched her shoulder gently, and left. The house grew still again. Marlene looked once more at her walls, every inch restored, every story reclaimed. She felt neither triumph nor vindication this time, only peace. Then, from her study, her phone chimed. A new message. She crossed the room, the echo of her footsteps soft against the floor. The sender was unfamiliar, the domain tagged with unga.gov. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she opened it. "Dear Mrs. Whitcomb, the National Gallery of Art is preparing an upcoming exhibition on American private collections of the 20th century. Your story and your curatorial eye have reached us. We respectfully request the loan of 5 original works from the Whitcomb collection for inclusion in our 2026 program. We understand your conditions of ownership and preservation and will fully abide by the Whitcomb Trust's guidelines." For a long moment, Marlene didn't move. The cursor blinked below the message like a heartbeat. Outside, a lone car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly through the window before disappearing down the street. She set the phone down slowly, her gaze drifting back to the Channing landscape, the one she'd almost lost, and the one that had, somehow, brought everything full circle. A slow smile touched her lips. "So," she murmured to herself, "even Washington noticed." She turned off the light, leaving only the faint glow of the gallery behind her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to guard her legacy. She had already won it. But still, she couldn't resist one final whisper as she closed the study door behind her. "5 originals," she said softly, a spark of challenge in her tone. "Let's make them earn it." The National Gallery's invitation arrived on a Friday morning, simple, elegant, and unmistakably official. The gold-lettered logo of the museum gleamed at the top, and beneath it, the message was direct. The National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C., Whitcomb, Rightful Hands, an exhibition of private American collections, 2026. It was everything Marlene had dreamed of in her younger days, the validation that her collection was now more than a personal legacy. It was part of the nation's shared history. But as she read through the carefully worded request, the faintest shadow of doubt crept across her mind. The trust had always been her safeguard, and it wasn't about to change now. She glanced at the framed portrait of her late husband on the mantel, the steady presence of a partner who'd believed in the power of control and the importance of never letting anyone rewrite her story. The terms of the invitation were gracious, offering the exhibition's full support for the loan of her collection, with one clear stipulation: the National Gallery would respect the Whitcomb Preservation Trust's conditions of ownership, including full credit to Marlene as the sole curator and owner of every piece. Marlene paused, tapping her pen against the desk. "Only under my terms." She had no interest in donating her work under the guise of generosity. She'd watched Haley attempt to bend the system, but no one would ever do the same to her. With a steady hand, she drafted her response. I am honored to participate in your upcoming exhibition, Whitcomb, Rightful Hands. However, as per the terms of the Whitcomb Preservation Trust, all works loaned will remain under my ownership and are to be returned in full upon the exhibition's completion. Any future display, lending, or selling of these works must adhere to the stipulations of the trust, with no deviation from these conditions. Thank you for respecting this. She signed it, then dropped it into the envelope. Her terms were clear. If they wanted her collection, they'd take it on her terms. 3 months later, the exhibition was announced with great fanfare. The posters dotted every major city from New York to San Francisco. Whitcomb, Rightful Hands, an exploration of American private collections. Inside the National Gallery, the work was displayed with a reverence befitting its history. The lighting was perfect, the wall text carefully designed, and each painting hung where it had been meant to be, in complete accordance with the care Marlene had always given them. There were no shared accolades, no mention of Haley, no hint of anyone but Marlene in the narrative. The press raved about the exhibit, and reporters had no shortage of questions, all directed at the quietly poised figure who stood beside the pieces. She wasn't just an owner now, she was a reclamation. The artists were celebrated, their works now associated with a name that had returned its rightful owner. The evening of the opening gala, Marlene stood in the center of the room, surrounded by patrons, critics, and the city's elite. Her silver hair glowed under the spotlights, and her poise commanded respect. She wore a simple, elegant dress, her only adornment a small pin that had belonged to her mother, a simple gold circle symbolic of continuity. As the final guest list was compiled, a soft murmur passed through the crowd. Haley had tried to make an appearance, of course. Marlene glanced at the door just as a security guard stepped forward, shaking his head. Haley stood, flanked by a small group of photographers, arguing with a museum employee. She wore a bold, dark red dress, clearly out of place in the room's atmosphere. But there were no cameras for her here, no admiring gazes, only the soft clink of her heels against marble as she was gently escorted away. Marlene didn't look, but she could hear the quiet dissatisfaction in the room as Haley's entourage slipped away. She smiled faintly, a soft, satisfied curve of the lips. Let her try. She had nothing left to claim. Later that night, the gallery was filled with applause, not for Haley, but for Marlene. As the evening drew to a close, Connor raised a glass at her side. His voice was low, but firm. To ownership and truth. Marlene looked around the room, the faces in the crowd illuminated by the golden warmth of the gallery's chandeliers, the paintings, her collection, all gleaming with a quiet brilliance. To truth, she echoed. The soft click of glasses rang in the air, a perfect, harmonious note. The evening was theirs, and for the first time, it felt like the weight of every stolen moment, every misstep, was finally balanced. Peter stood by the door, watching with a quiet smile, arms folded. His gaze met hers, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. He'd seen it all, watched her rebuild, reclaim, and protect. As the guests slowly drifted toward the exits, Marlene stood alone beside Evening on the Battery, her favorite piece. The brush strokes shimmered in the low light, as familiar to her as the morning sky over Charleston Harbor. She stood, watching the last few visitors, the distant hum of the gala just behind her. For the first time, the gallery felt like home again. It wasn't just a collection of paintings, it was her story. As the final guest stepped out, Julian approached, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "You did it," he said simply. Marlene nodded, looking over the collection once more. "I did," she agreed. "And they'll remember it too." Then, as the doors clicked shut and the gallery stood still, one last thought settled in her mind. Haley wasn't the only one who would make a mark on this city, and it was only a matter of time before everyone else realized that too. Charleston greeted her like an old friend that had finally learned to behave. The late afternoon light dripped down the cobblestones along the Battery, soft and golden, as Marlene's car turned the last corner toward home. The Whitcomb house, her house, stood waiting, every shutter straight, every window gleaming. Through the tall front windows she could already see the familiar silhouettes of her collection return to their rightful place, the paintings casting gentle shadows across the walls. It was quiet again. Not the suffocating silence that had once filled these rooms, but a peace that hummed beneath the surface. A home restored. Peter had made sure the final shipment from Washington arrived that morning. She'd refused fanfare, instructing the team to leave the crates in the front hall. Now they waited there in a tidy row, the last pieces of her legacy ready to be rejoined with the rest. She removed her gloves, ran a hand along the smooth surface of one crate, and smiled faintly. All back where they belong. On her desk lay a thick, cream-colored envelope stamped with the National Gallery's seal. She opened it carefully and withdrew a small, engraved bronze plaque, the kind affixed to exhibition walls. It read, in precise serif lettering, "The Whitcomb Collection. Curated and owned by Marlene Whitcomb." No asterisks, no shared credit, no omissions. Marlene traced the letters with her fingertips, feeling the quiet satisfaction settle deep in her chest. This was how history was supposed to read. A knock echoed softly at the door. When she opened it, Lindsay stood there, her hair swept into a messy knot, sunglasses still perched in her hair despite the fading light. "Well, damn," she said, stepping inside and looking around the immaculate foyer. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you scared half of Charleston straight." Marlene laughed, a genuine, warm sound. "It wasn't fear I wanted. It was acknowledgement." Lindsay turned slowly, her gaze falling on the nearest painting, the marshland at dusk that had once hung crookedly in the museum's exhibit. "Never thought revenge could look this classy," she said, smirking. Marlene paused, her expression softening. "It wasn't revenge," she said quietly. "It was restoration." For a moment the sisters stood together in the long hallway, the scent of varnish and salt air mingling. The light from the front windows stretched across the polished floor, touching the base of every frame like a benediction. Lindsay exhaled, then nudged her gently. "You always did have better taste than the rest of us." Marlene smiled. "That's because I never confused ownership with understanding." They shared a small laugh before Lindsay excused herself to fetch the wine from the kitchen. Marlene remained in the study, facing the last empty space on the wall, the one she'd saved for last. The final painting, Evening on the Battery, leaned against the crate beside her desk, its protective wrap still in place. She knelt carefully, her movements slow but precise, as if she were handling a living thing. Removing the covering, she revealed the canvas beneath, the familiar sweep of blue-gray skies and harbor light, every brushstroke preserved. "This is where you belong," she murmured, lifting it into place. When it settled onto the hook, perfectly level, she stepped back. For the first time since this began, the room felt whole. Every wall reclaimed, every shadow put back in order. From the kitchen, Lindsay called, "Do you want red or white?" "Red," Marlene replied, still staring at the painting. Something aged, something earned. Lindsay returned a moment later, 2 glasses in hand. She handed one to Marlene, who took it without breaking her gaze from the wall. The sisters clinked their glasses together. "To peace," Lindsay said. Marlene considered that. "To permanence," she corrected softly. They drank. Lindsay wandered toward the window, glancing out at the slow drift of twilight over the harbor. "You really did it, you know," she said. "You didn't just win. You rewrote the ending." Marlene turned toward her desk. The trust papers, the gallery plaque, the framed court order, all neatly arranged. Every battle she'd fought had come down to this: control, clarity, truth. She set her wine glass down and let her fingers brush across the cool bronze of the plaque one last time. "I didn't rewrite anything," she said. "I just made sure the story was told properly." The clock chimed 7. Outside, the harbor wind picked up, carrying the sound of gulls and the faint hum of distant ships. Inside, everything was still, the calm of a life restored to symmetry. Marlene crossed to the armchair in the corner of her study, poured herself a final half glass, and sat. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its glow casting a faint shimmer across the glass that shielded her paintings. Each piece seemed to breathe again, alive with the warmth of its rightful place. Lindsay lingered by the doorway, smiling. "You're going to miss the fight, you know?" Marlene took a slow sip of wine, eyes on the painting. "No," she said. "The fight missed me." Lindsay laughed, shaking her head, then disappeared down the hall. The house fell quiet again, the kind of silence that didn't ache anymore. It simply existed. Marlene leaned back, one hand resting on the arm of her chair, the other holding the stem of her glass. Her reflection met her gaze in the framed glass of evening on the battery. Every struggle, every stolen moment, every betrayal, it all ended here, in this still room filled with truth. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both peace and victory. "She donated my collection without asking," she whispered, her voice low and certain. "So I reclaimed it, one frame at a time." Outside, the tide rolled in quietly, the waves brushing against the edge of the battery like applause. And inside, surrounded by everything she had fought to restore, Marlene Whitcomb finally exhaled.